Hello and welcome to the Political Opinions podcast, where every opinion is given equal footing and political tolerance and debate are given their proper attention in a world where both are on the decline. Today's episode is a continuation from earlier in the week regarding opinions on political tolerance, but while last episode covered the generic application of political tolerance, this episode will cover the different opinions on applying political tolerance to the workings of government and legislative bodies. The objective of this episode is not to attempt to prove whether or not political tolerance should be practiced in government, but rather to convey the different opinions on the topic and help promote debate on the issue. I am taking political tolerance in this regard as working with those of different viewpoints, most often in different parties, but it can include working with those of different viewpoints within your own party. I will begin with the arguments as to why political tolerance shouldn't be applied to government, followed by the counters with a comparison at the end. Most arguments opposed to political tolerance in government support an ideology of sorts. And one of these ideas is essentially that, given members of legislative bodies are elected, their first priority should be to argue for the views of their voters, which means that working with those of other viewpoints can be considered to be breaching the trust of voters by helping to at least promote conflicting ideas. For example, it is safe to assume that if an American voter votes the Republicans over the Democrats, they may not be too eager to support a Republican congressman or senator, for example, than working with and promoting a Democrat's ideas. Furthermore, political tolerance to a lot of these people is often merely used as a pragmatic approach. If a party is in the minority or lacks a solid majority, then they may need to work with other parties merely as a pragmatic need. But then, once they are in the position to achieve their means without the other party, they no longer have to be tolerant. And therefore, tolerance isn't often a supported practice and a necessity in government, but rather a means of pragmatism within government. You're tolerant when you need to be, but you don't always have to be. Tolerance can also be seen to prevent the achievement of solid outcomes in favour of a party or viewpoint. If you are constantly promoting and cooperating with the ideas of other parties in order to pass legislation, then it can be claimed that your viewpoint is being diluted and the outcome may not be one that your voters wanted. In a continuation of ensuring that members of legislative bodies represent their voters, it is therefore the responsibility of legislative members to ensure that they represent their voters. Therefore, they need to act to make sure that their party's aims are achieved and not diluted by other ideologies. And then there's the idea of why be tolerant if the other side isn't going to be tolerant. This is more of a negative viewpoint, but essentially it stems around the idea that if the other party isn't tolerant with your views, then you shouldn't be tolerant with theirs. Politics isn't a fair game and doesn't require you to be the better man, it merely requires you to win. And therefore you can use whatever means possible to achieve your outcome, and to some people that means not being politically tolerant. Furthermore, there is nothing wrong with being ideologically driven. Often, government isn't just about achieving an outcome, but rather sticking to and representing the values of your members and your voters. This means that to some, even if they don't win in the game of politics, it is often more important that instead of winning, they hold on to their values and to ensure that they are not diminished in the name of pragmatism. This can often be seen with small parties refusing to work with other conflicting viewpoints in order to defend their idea. And essentially this is the idea that you don't just have to win, but sometimes holding on to your ideology and ensuring that it continues to exist is more important. And finally, many will argue that there will be a time for most political groups and ideologies where tolerance isn't needed. Similar to the early viewpoint about tolerance being pragmatic, it is often better to stick to your values in order to ensure that if your ideas and party gain traction, then you are seen to be consistent. Tolerance can be seen as being weak and can harm trust, as in the past, if you have constantly sacrificed your ideas and policies in order to work with other people, voters may then question whether or not you are going to do that now, and therefore it's better to be consistent and always apply your ideology and values, so if you do become the majority party, you are then able to stick to that. On the other side, however, for the arguments in favour of political tolerance in government, these again tend to stem around the idea of ideology isn't the most important aspect. And to begin with, there's also the idea that you represent your entire area. You don't just represent the people who specifically voted for you. You represent everyone. Therefore, even people who didn't vote for you should have their views in some way represented, and as such, members of legislative bodies have a responsibility to support the views of everyone there and work with other parties to ensure that the outcome benefits as many people as possible from the area that voted for you. These people would also claim that pragmatism is very important. Sometimes values and ideologies can be sacrificed, and working with other parties often helps to ensure that necessary actions are passed which benefit people. Half-hearted and compromise-based material is often seen as being better than nothing at all. For example, some would argue that divisions between Republicans and Democrats regarding financial bills to aid in the lockdown from the coronavirus pandemic have shown how sometimes ideology can cause problems when people's lives are at stake. It's better sometimes just to compromise and therefore to at least produce an outcome that people can benefit from. Moving on from this, some would argue that it is silly to push only for your absolute ideas. At least in democracies, there are numerous different ideologies and viewpoints, and as such, it is often unrealistic to expect to have actions in government only support one viewpoint. Working with different members within your own party and members of other parties on issues where you all desire a similar outcome is better than none of you achieving anything, given that you refuse to compromise and refuse to cooperate. Furthermore, democracy means that you are almost always unlikely to be in a position where you can disregard everyone else, and as such, it is in government's interest to work with others, so that when you need them more than they need you, you still have the chance to participate and not just end up as, for example, a useless opposition party. Members of governments have a responsibility to protect people, not just support their own viewpoint. And a lot of people would argue that the majority of voters would rather have half-hearted responses that protect and benefit everyone rather than an ideology being adhered to constantly by a party. Furthermore, with regard to being tolerant if the other side is intolerant, many would argue that being better than the other side ensures that you have a consistent claim to be inclusive, and therefore more people will be willing to vote for you and work with you than if you are seen as an isolated and uncooperative party. Therefore, the arguments in favour of political tolerance would take a more pragmatic approach than those on the other side. Then regarding the comparison, the first question is how important is political tolerance? Those opposing it would say that it is merely a means of staying relevant when in the minority. It can be disregarded when pragmatism doesn't require you to be tolerant. It is not an absolutism, but merely a means to an end. While on the other side, they would say that tolerance is almost an end in itself, as it helps to ensure trust, cooperation, and generally more inclusive outcomes that are achieved by governments. Tolerance will always be needed to these people, as you will not always be in the positive limelight. You may sometimes be in the negative in the minority, and therefore you should always be tolerant of other views. Regarding the outcomes that political tolerance in government achieves, those opposed to it would say that often these viewpoints are rubbish. It's better to have your own viewpoint and and work towards a proper and fully developed outcome than have a half-hearted outcome just for the sake of producing results. Or those on the other side would claim that these half-hearted outcomes are still better than no outcome at all. Sometimes situations require you to swallow your pride and work with others for the benefit of everyone. Then, regarding who do you represent, those who oppose political tolerance would say that you represent your voters first and foremost. You should stick to their views and their ideologies, and you are betraying their trust if you work with other parties and are tolerant of other views. However, those on the other side would say that you shouldn't just ignore everyone who hasn't voted for you. These are still people, and they still may need to vote for you next time, and therefore it is in your interest to be pragmatic, to include aspects of their ideologies. You don't have to include the whole thing, these people would say, but rather just include aspects of it to ensure that many different viewpoints are incorporated into outcomes. And then finally, on the issue of ideological or pragmatic politics, those in favour of ideology would say that it's better again to support your ideology or party or whatever it may be and be driven and be consistent with that than to participate in compromise and often be involved in ineffective actions through said compromise and tolerance of other views in the decision-making process. And often, politics, the aim isn't always to win, but to stick to your ideology and ensure your views are still represented. But those on the other side would say that it can be viewed as shallow to value an ideology so much that you reject all forms of tolerance, and that often tolerance is needed to ensure actions benefit everyone and that there is at least an outcome. Essentially, it's the idea of what is the point of sticking to an ideology when it doesn't benefit anyone, Yeah, sure, you may be viewed as being morally superior in sticking with your ideology, but these people, again, are more realistic in their approach and less ideological, and would say, what's the point of this when there's no outcome as a result? Ultimately, one's view on political tolerance within government comes down to their how much they value ideology within said government. If one values an ideology very much so and wants to ensure that it is present and supported within government, they are more likely to advocate for less political tolerance. But if someone instead supports pragmatism and producing outcomes even with compromise, then they are more likely to advocate for political tolerance. The vast majority of politicians and members of government and legislative bodies advocate for the pragmatic approach, given the complex nature and ever-changing maelstroms of opinions. But as people, such as Jeremy Corbyn, have shown, there are still those who are willing to press for their ideology over pragmatism and strive for a specific and particular vision, even if it means sacrificing some ability to work with others and reducing your chances of achieving political success. What do you think? Anything I got wrong on the issue, missed or could have done better, and what are your opinions on this topic? Let me know on Twitter or in the comments, and be sure to check back next week for the different opinions on military intervention without international approval. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you all soon.